Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Jacob Land. And as we take a look at the late 1800s in Europe, we have first talked about the Second Industrial Revolution and some of the key elements of that. Today, we're going to talk a little bit about union aspects and then also the redesign of cities, and finally, the role of women and the growth of another ism of this century, feminism. So, again, where we left off, we had taken a look at this map, which discussed the industrial regions of Europe by the end of the 1800s. So, as you can see from the chart and the key below, where the key manufacturing areas are, we also see the greatest development in society in Europe. And so typically, this is the northern and western areas of Europe. The central, eastern, and far eastern areas of Europe are developing slowly. We're not going to say that they're backwards, but they are behind the development of the West. We had taken a look at this briefly before from a perspective of industrialization. We're going to add to that now, as this is one of the silk factories in Japan. And as you may notice, the workers here are female. And so women definitely do have their place in industrial society. We're going to take a look at how they are involved. Another slide here that also shows the role of women in the society in the new world, which is slowly becoming not so much of a new world as part of the rest of the world. So, first, briefly, women in work, and then we'll come back to feminism a few slides down the road here. The Second Industrial Revolution has a significant impact on the lives of women. And so part of feminism will be the controversial idea of the right to work for women in particular. And so we see the idea of domesticity developing. And the idea of domesticity is the idea that a woman, because of her nurturing qualities, should be in the house and should be working with the children and supplementing their educational experiences and again nurturing their growth. Younger women do have an opportunity to work and are able to. However, many times they will be in situations that we would call sweatshops, so very poor working conditions. And because of the shortage of male workers, women do have an opportunity to get out in the workforce. Often, though, we have the gender stereotypical roles, such as shop clerks, secretaries, and teachers. Teachers, in particular, because, again, this is an extension of the nurturing role of females. And so once a woman would become pregnant and sometimes just simply married, the woman would not be able to work, as this was contradictory to a pure ideology. Slowly but surely, we will see freedom being gained from the domestic patterns and the various dirty, quote unquote, jobs, the difficult jobs out there. Sadly, as we have discussed in the past, prostitution was still a significant job opportunity for females, often in these urban cities and near military areas such as naval ports. And so when women were unable to gain work or the family needed extra income, it was seen quite often where women would become prostitutes and work for a period of time in the hopes of accumulating enough money to help the family or to be able to make it. And again, we'll touch on that later. New jobs for women because of the new technologies, as you see in this slide here as well, the telephone exchange. And many of you are spoiled by today's modern telephone technology. In the good old days, you would call on the phone and you would be connected to a person. And if the people that you were calling had a telephone, often it was shared with the entire family and all other families that were within that area, perhaps even the street. And so it was the hope that when you identified who you called, everybody else would hang up. But this may have been the birth of eavesdropping as well. I'm not sure, but in Jacob land, we can certainly question that. Organizing the working class, again, as we've talked about in the past, socialism is constantly there and promoting and pushing the idea of proletarianization or the promotion of the working class. In Germany, we see the German Social Democratic Party, or SPD, and typically many of these had limited success. It won't really be until the Russian Revolution of 1917 where socialist ideas and the Russian and future Soviet versions of communism take hold. Evolutionary socialism is a more novel, gradual approach to socialism as opposed to a radical change as Marx and Engels had suggested previously. People such as Edward Bernstein and others advocated for a slow and gradual movement towards socialism, where the society would have more and more of a say and a control in the economic environment. Trade unions, again, and the idea of unionism would promote better living and working conditions, taking the local area here. Most of you are familiar with where Goodyear is in downtown Akron. And so around the Goodyear area initially, in Goodyear Heights and those areas, the managers and upper echelon lived, and the workers would be in some type of tenement housing right next to the factories. As transportation and technology during this era we are discussing developed, the managers and business owners would progressively move farther out and away from the factories themselves, and the houses that they left and moved away from would then be taken by this working class as new opportunities developed. The anarchist alternative, again, anarchy has a negative connotation to it of being complete chaos and very disruptive, very negative. However, anarchy in some elements also could represent simply the diminishing role or lack of a government in a society. We certainly in this era, as is evidenced by the anarchists in 1881 that assassinated Alexander II in Russia, we know that the anarchists also had alternatives that weren't pleasant. Proletarians here, as we've talked about, are being promoted to unite. One of the dilemmas here that will constantly plague the idea of Marx and communism is this Communist International of their Communist Manifesto. They are under the ideology that all workers of all trades and all social structures and societies would unite. The reality, however, is that depending on where you were and what your situation was, that certainly would not be necessary or a desirable thing to do. European population trends, as we're going to move towards family structures and discussions of those eras as well. You can see here the various major areas of Europe, and again, slide 1, and then slide 2. And so in the areas you can see populations continuing to grow. And so we want to look at why this is happening. So obviously, when society is going well, families tend to be somewhat larger in size. However, we have another phenomena that we will discuss later, and this idea is the idea of entertainment. And so as the people see the value and desire entertainment, plays, theaters, sports such as soccer in Europe, people will tend to limit family size as they wish to keep a larger amount of money for themselves and for their families in order to be able to do more. So, one reason for population growth is the growth of family size. However, that is certainly not the only reason. Another large reason or strong explanation for this is the declines in death rate. And so this new industrialization and growth of science is leading to many, many more medical discoveries. It's also leading to improved environmental conditions. And in particular, in this urbanization, we're going to see a redesign of cities that will improve sanitation and nutrition. So, briefly here, as we talk about this, the urbanization and redesign of the cities. We had talked about Napoleon III earlier and had mentioned that his redesign of Paris through the help of Baron Haussmann was to beautify the city, but also to make it a much more difficult idea of rebellion and barricading areas. So, with the opening of boulevards and the new wide roads in Paris, many of the narrow alleyways were taken out. And again, I think of Harry Potter and those scenes where he is purchasing his wands in those very narrow streets as the way it once was. Many public buildings and gardens are also being created. And again, referring to Paris, the Paris Opera House is built. We also begin to see our first subway stations by the end of the century, and many of you are familiar with the Eiffel Tower. That as well was developed in the late 1800s, 1889. Urban land and renting in the cities continued to grow, and so now the countryside once again becomes more relevant as the middle class looks to move away from the urban congestion, and also in order to have an opportunity of openness for them and their families. So we see the suburbs begin to develop in our concentric circle. Earlier, as we've talked about the city of Boston as one example in America, where the city was built along the waterways, the construction of the cities were often built on an as-needed basis. Now the cities are being constructed increasingly in a grid-like structure and an organized structure in order to promote city life. Sanitation is a very, very important thing to the social and political stability of the city. And so it was widely believed that if the sanitation and living conditions would improve, then a society would be more politically stable. In the mid 1800s, however, we know that diseases such as cholera and dysentery, etc., were often spread through the poor sanitation of these areas. They began to follow the patterns and realized that an improvement in sanitation and city cleanup programs being launched would help improve city life and also reduce disease. And so we see new water and sewer systems being developed, and some people even say that that might have been the best or the greatest invention of the second half of the 1800s. Wherever the sanitation conditions were improving, we also saw a significant drop in the mortality rates. Acts such as the Public Health Act in Britain in the late 1840s and also the Moulin Act in France, as well as various other laws throughout Europe, helped the home inspections and home inspectors to do a better job of maintaining proper sanitation and proper housing conditions, and most importantly, proper public health. In today's world, some of the medical breakthroughs we know about: Louis Pasteur, we know about Joseph Lister. Both of those people were significant in the aid and help of the improvement of these conditions. Moving along here, we see the population growth of Europe on these two maps. And again, 1820 to 1900, you can see the significant change that takes place. And again, when people are increasing their populace, they tend to also move. And so their viabilities and ability to move increases. And as you can see, the areas here in this immigration chart, you can see the patterns of movement. This is a continuation of that with the rest of Europe, primarily Southern and Eastern Europe. Often these conditions weren't necessarily the kindest to people. Some people did it for new opportunities to escape, even as in the past, persecution of political, religious, or other sort. And many times these people came with little or nothing. And so, if you recall in American history, this was the late 1800s where you saw the creation of many centers of ethnicities. So, Little Italy or Slavic village, etc., etc. The urban environment, then, again, living conditions were linked to disease, as I mentioned before, and addressing water waste and pollution certainly helped to improve mortality rates by declining them, and also allowed us to improve the conditions within the city. We moved from private enterprises to public law within housing, and so living conditions were often linked to political and moral health, as a summary of what we just talked about. Reconstruction plans, again, separated the home and the work areas within these cities, as mentioned earlier. This photo here shows us a destruction of the Parisian area, and again, the beginning of the reconstruction of the wider areas and the boulevards. Again, we see a later picture here, and again, you can see a much more open, grand style, very inviting. Again, you can think of cities, any major city, the downtown area is typically where you would go today for sporting events, plays, operas, and other types of entertainment. The social structure, again, the upper classes, which was very small in percentage, controlled a significant amount of the wealth. The middle class, again, is a very difficult one, as we've talked about, to define, as people in this middle class will tend to classify themselves at different levels than they may be. And again, it's very difficult to define them based on family size as well as income, etc. The lower classes, again, attributed to the majority of the society. Again, many of them were still agricultural, as the need for food in these urban and suburban settings required many, many people to work the land. In terms of urban settings, again, we had the skilled and unskilled labor. We had domestic servants. So, again, in the past, we had discussed how the teenage girls would move out and would move into homes and would almost often be treated as an additional family member. They would earn some type of wage, and that wage would be kept in part by them and sent home to the family to help. We also see during this time frame where many European men would work in America and elsewhere in the world, and they would work for stretches of time, and then they would send their money home and return to visit the family every so often, typically perhaps 4 to 6 months. The question of women and the role of women. So we need to take a look at this and the women's experiences. And so the idea of femininity and feminine attributes was still very, very high in this society. And women typically would remain, however, very economically dependent, legally inferior to the men, regardless of social classes. We will see acts such as the Marriage or Married Woman's Property Act in the late 1880s in Britain, which allowed women to own property. In France, we know that the rights of women, even though we would see France as a more liberal society, the rights of women were minimal compared to many of the more modern areas of Europe. Birth rates and birth control. Again, we know that from the Catholic standpoint, the purpose of conception and having relations was to fulfill God and the Bible. We know that birth control became an increasing issue and a need as more and more families were openly not getting married at as much of a young age as in the past. Birth control then became an object of necessity for women, and we know that several laws were also passed in order to promote the well-being of women. And again, often though, these laws were very much skewed towards the men. And so, again, we'll mention a couple of these later, but laws such as the rights of the husband over the children and the idea that extramarital affairs and whatnot could take place much more readily for the males than for the females. The middle class family began to see more of a togetherness, leisure time, and tradition, which had been the culture of the elite in the past. And so now these opportunities to relax and have family time becomes an increasingly important part of the family. Higher paying jobs make it possible to live on the husband's wages. And again, this reinforces the idea of domesticity for the women. In this painting as well, you can see the extended family here taking part in a birthday celebration of this family. This illustration also shows the advent of the scouting movement and wearing a uniform, watching a ship at sea. And again, obviously down the road, they don't know about it, but in wartime, this will become a increasingly valuable commodity or ability. Middle class families taking vacations. So you see this beach. Again, they're probably wearing clothes that you would not see at a typical beach in America, but nonetheless, they are certainly relaxing and enjoying the afternoon. Education during this time, mass education was in the state-run system, states' liberal, industrial, and political motives, again, following the Enlightenment ideas that a society that is more knowledgeable and educated would be a more reasonable society and would be able to promote the educated decisions of a given society. Not only that, but in imperialism, as we shall see, we note that a society defines its intellect as one aspect of its superiority. And so, as we take a look at this slide here, again, mass education becomes increasingly significant. National values, so nationalism, is becoming very important. Boys and girls, however, are still educated in different ways. And so, most universities were not open to women until the end of the 1800s. And so, there are a number of them that slowly but surely did allow women. The absence of secondary schools for women as well also would prevent them from learning skills that would make them successful at a university level. And so, in a way, the society and the culture of the society indirectly was designed to have the women in these secondary roles. And so, female teachers would be one of these roles, as I had mentioned before, as an extension of the nurturing qualities of females. And so teaching training institutes increasingly developed. Finally, we see literacy in newspapers increasing, and the demand for newspapers and up-to-date information and knowledge about the world from any given aspect also made things significant. In today's world, I know that we like to read the tabloids and the gossip. They were very much the same as you and I. As they saw tabloids, they liked the interesting, cheap literature that would provide the entertainment, news, and information of the day. A woman's college here, picture here. And again, we had talked about the women's desire for higher education. Most women, again, clerks, lower jobs, and the teaching profession. This is dear to my heart, and so you can see this. It was developed as Kick the Dane's Head back earlier in the late 1700s, early 1800s, and then subsequently begins to formulate into football, F-U-T-B-A-L, our modern soccer in Great Britain, and then eventually becomes an offshoot of many different sports down the road. Ladies as well were able to play, although the ladies' outfits were a little more difficult probably to play in than the men's. We see mass leisure time and the ability to enjoy the entertainment opportunities of a society, but we'll save that for the next time. So again, today we talked about the role of women, we talked about the changing cities, city life, and we talked about the growth and change in population trends and emigration in Europe. Hope this was helpful, and we look forward to you coming back to